In this video, I'm going to show you how to create photorealistic models using Photoview 360. We're going to apply materials, we're going to apply decals, and we're going to apply scenes and lights. There are many ways of doing this. You can use third-party programs such as Keyshot. You can also use SolidWorks Visualize, but in this case, we're going to use Photoview 360, which is possibly not the most powerful or even easy to use bit of software, but it is embedded into SolidWorks, and that makes it much easier to use when you're creating a model, because you can go backwards and forwards, you can change the model as you're creating those views if necessary. The approaches that all bits of software use is pretty much the same. The terminology is very much the same as well. So it's not a difficult thing to go from one rendering package to another. Now, if you don't have this option, you can add it in by going to Tools, scroll down to where it says Add-ins, it's in here somewhere, and you'll have all the options for adding in. You can click on here and it will add it into this session, or you can click here and it will add it in when you start up. The first thing we need to do to put a logo on there is select a logo file. So you'll need to download a file from either from the internet or you create your own file. The best file format to use typically is PNG, because that will allow you to have a transparent background. What we're going to do is, if we go across to where it says Display Manager, we have options here of creating view, scenes, lights and cameras, and here we've got decals. One option is open the decal library. Now that's fine if you happen to have something already in place, but we don't. So we're going to add a decal in place. So to add in a decal, the easiest one is actually just to go to Edit Decal, even though you don't have one to edit. From there, you can go and select an image that you want to essentially paste onto your component. So go Browse. I'm going to select this one here. As I said, that's a PNG file. And once we have that image, we need to tell SolidWorks where we'd like it placed. And placing it on the component is called mapping. So if we go to the mapping tab, we can select either a face to apply it to. So we've got these options. That's a face. We've got a surface. We can apply it to a body, or we can apply it to an individual feature. Now we simply want to apply it to a face, so all we have to do is select that face, and you can see that it's attempted to apply the decal on there. We can rotate that around to wherever we want. We probably want to have that rotated to around 90 degrees. You can either do it using this interactive rotate command, or you can go to mapping and you can scroll down to where you've got the rotation. So I'm going to type in 90. Now again, it's a bit bigger than we want, and it's extending beyond that face. We can move this around by just dragging it. We can change the size, grabbing those little points and move it around. Now there are a variety of different ways of attaching it to the face. We can either have it as a projection, which is the default. We can have it as a label, or we can have it spherical. So if it was around a spherical object, we can map it onto that spherical object. Cylindrical, could probably get away with cylindrical because this surface is slightly cylindrical, but really the best option is just projection. So again, just resize that. Now you'll see as a projection, as I drag it, it will follow that face around. Now we don't want the black background, we just want the lettering. To do that, we can remove the lettering by going back to image, and we can use a thing called a mask. So if you haven't used masks in other programs, what mask does is it allows you to remove various sections of the background. There's a couple of different ways of doing this. The two that are most commonly used is a selective color mask. So you can select that. You can then select the eyedropper tool and select the colors on the image that you want to remove. But because this is a PNG file, we can actually use the actual file itself as a mask. So we can use that image mask file. Again, we just select that image again, hit that, and now it's used the image as a mask. Now that's just a little bit more reliable. If your image isn't a perfect one color background, then it may well leave some bits behind. So this is a much more reliable option. If we go back to the assembly, you'll find now that image has translated itself into the assembly. In this next step, we're going to create a photorealistic view of this hairdryer. But to do that, we need to position it so that it'll sit flat on a surface. Otherwise, it just is not going to look very realistic at all. This is actually quite simple to do. What we need is a plane that represents the surface that the hairdryer is going to sit on. And as you can imagine, it would sit naturally on 3 points. One on the underside of the handle, another point under here somewhere, and another point along about here somewhere. So to create that, we need to create 3 points. We can create points using a 3D sketch. So if we go to 3D sketch, and then we'll select points on some of these edges. So we use the point item here, and we can just click that approximately. It doesn't have to be very accurate, but it just has to be close enough so that it looks realistic. So 1 there, 1, again, just an estimate of roughly where you think this thing would sit. 1 there, and then 1 somewhere in on this face, and then the third one somewhere on this face, approximately where we think that would sit. So those 3 points now can form a plane. So to create a plane, we go Insert, Reference Geometry, Plane, and we can select those points now that are in the right location. So the first reference point is that point there, second reference point, that point there, and the third one here. And that creates a plane, which now is where our hairdryer would naturally sit if it was sitting on a surface. You can see that the curly cord, though, doesn't sit properly. Now that's again going to look very strange, so we need to modify the curly cord so that it will sit in the right location, so that it's just sitting on that plane. That's relatively easy to do. So all we have to do is edit this curly cord so that the coils will be just touching that plane. Now, I want to see this plane here, but it's disappeared on me. Now, first thing we'll check is to see whether it's visible, and it is visible because we don't want to hide it. So the fact that it's actually got a dark blue symbol there shows that it's visible, but we still can't see it. If that's the case, then it probably isn't turned on in the views area. So if we go View, Hide Show, then we need to look at planes, make sure that's selected. And now we can see all the planes that are not hidden. So what we need to do here is to move the curly cord so that its lower edge is sitting exactly on this plane. Now we can do that fairly simply because there's a plane that runs through the middle of the curly cord, and that plane, which is this one here, the top plane in the curly cord, and we can just offset that, so create a distance mate between that plane and our newly created plane 1. So to do this, I'm going to put a distance mate between those 2 planes. Now the problem here is that the curly cord has already been fully defined. So if I try and put another mate relationship on here, it's going to make a conflict between some of the existing mates. It's actually easier to put the mates in place and find out which ones are conflicting and then just fix them or delete them than it is to try to work out which ones they are. So it comes up with this error and it says the mate couldn't be successfully created because there's already mates that have defined this part. So the easy thing to do is just to basically add this mate, and then we can delete the other mates that are a problem. So hit OK, and it moves into the right spot. And we can see now that we have, if we go to our mates in the hairdryer assembly, and under the curly cord, we see there's a distance between the right plane. We just want to delete that. And there's also a distance between those 2 mates. Of course, they're no longer parallel, so we can delete that as well. Now we see that the curly cord, although it's in the right place, it's actually a little bit low, and the reason for that is because it's got the mate on the wrong side. So we can just go and edit that mate and then flip the dimension to the other side, and the curly cord will move up to the position that it's supposed to be in, and that's all good. Okay, so that's all looking good. That's the way it should be. Now we can move on to making a photorealistic image of this component. So to do that, we select Photoview 360 and we're going to edit the scene that the component is in. Now the first thing we can do is select an image to put into the background. So if we browse for an image, and now that's the image that we want. That can either be uploaded from the internet or you can take your own photograph and install it. Now we just need to position the hairdryer in the right location. You can see there's a shadow under the hairdryer, and that shadow is a little bit offset. And the problem with that is that the shadow doesn't actually touch the hairdryer, so it looks a bit weird. To fix that, we can go to the floor. Now, a floor is basically a theoretical plane that the object will sit on. So when the image is rendered, it will throw its shadows onto the floor. So what we need to do is to make that coincident with usually the surface of the bench top is going to be. So to align the floor, what we can do is we can select that plane that we've just created in order to sit the hairdryer on. Select that plane and then we hit OK. Now what you'll see is that the shadow has actually disappeared, but it will reappear when we do the final render. So unfortunately it doesn't show up in this particular image. Just to check it, we can go to Photoview 360, we can then select Preview window, and that will show us a preview of what our image is going to look like. And you can see there's a slight shadow on that component. Now you need to make sure that the floor, you've got floor reflection, and if you want a reflective surface, and floor shadows has been selected. Now you can actually do a floor offset. So if you wanted this thing to be hovering at 10 or 20 millimeters across off the surface, then you can use an offset for that. Now we can just move this around. This preview will then update to suit. So we can move it around to the right position. It's a little bit fiddly, but it is one of those things you just need to fiddle around with until you get it right. So I'm reasonably happy with that. Let's move on to the next point. So we can add a variety of things in here. We can add lights. So if we go Photoview 360 lights, we can, there's a couple of lights there. There's a directional light. Just double click on that. I'll just hide the preview for a moment. We can see that there's a light off to the top there. We can change the intensity of the light. We can give it shadows. We can do a whole variety of things with the shadow quality. There's a variety of things we can modify there. We can also add cameras and walkthroughs and so on. So there's plenty of things to play around with. And this is very time consuming, to be honest, but the more you play around with it, the better the image gets. So we can edit these lights, and as we move the lights around, you can see that the reflections change as the light moves. So we can use that as an indication of where we want the lights to be and what we want them to look like. It's often tempting to put lots of lights into an image, and in my experience, the more lights you put in there, the worse it starts to look. Typically, light doesn't come from a lot of different angles at once, and it tends to look better if it comes from a single angle. It's also important to make sure that the image and the scene has some ambient light as well. Now, it's also a good idea to make sure that you have perspective turned on, because if not, the model won't look very realistic. So to do that, go to View, Display, click on Perspective, and now the product has some perspective. With an object like this, it's difficult to work out how much perspective to put on on the item. So to modify the perspective, we go to View, Modify, and then Perspective, and we can change this value. Generally, the larger the number, the less perspective. So once you're happy with the final positioning, layout, background, lighting, and so on, then it's time to create the final render and the final output from this stage. So go to Photoview 360, click on Final Render, and then sit back and wait. Go get yourself a cup of coffee.